August 1814. The President of the United States has fled into the countryside. The Capitol stands empty, and foreign soldiers are walking through the White House. They stop, sit down, and eat the dinner still warm on the table before they set the building on fire and burn the Capitol next door down to a shell. Now, you'd assume the army torching America's capital was some great rival empire. It wasn't. It was, more or less, Canadians, British North Americans, and they were here for revenge because a year earlier, American troops had marched north and burned their capital first.
Hold that image. Two neighbors burning each other's capitals to the ground. Because today, those exact same two countries share the longest undefended border on the planet. Same continent, nearly the same culture. Two peoples who, honestly, kind of love each other. Which leaves a strange question hanging in the air, one almost nobody stops to ask. With all of that in common, why are they still two completely separate countries? And the answer is definitely not for lack of America trying. So let's get into it. Who tried to swallow Canada? Why they kept failing? And how a handful of British colonies decided they'd rather become something brand new.
First stop, the American Revolution, because the version everyone learns has 13 colonies. The real map had a lot more. When the 13 colonies rose up against London in 1775, there were actually more than 20 British colonies scattered across North America. To the north of the rebels sat 4 more: Newfoundland, Prince Edward Island, Nova Scotia, and Quebec. And at least one of them came genuinely close to joining the revolution. The Americans even had a name ready for it: the 14th colony.
The closest call was Nova Scotia, and it makes sense. About 3/4 of its settlers had come straight from New England. Benjamin Franklin himself owned land there. When tempers flared, Nova Scotians formed their own protest committees, just like the rebels down south. They even ran their own version of the Boston Tea Party, except instead of dumping tea, they torched a stockpile of hay meant for the British troops besieged in Boston. George Washington was paying attention. He sent secret agents north to find out whether the colony was ready to rise.
And America didn't just wait around. In 1775, an American army marched north to seize Canada and bolt it onto the Revolution. They actually took Montreal. Then they hit the walls of Quebec City in the middle of a brutal winter storm, and the whole assault fell apart. Their general was killed, their other commander wounded, and the survivors limped back south, many of them dying of smallpox along the way. The first attempt to conquer Canada was a total failure. It would not be the last. So why didn't Nova Scotia jump in anyway? Simple. The Americans talked them out of it by attacking them. As refugees and chaos spread, Washington unleashed privateers, basically state-sponsored pirates, on the Nova Scotia coast. And they didn't sort friend from foe. They looted and burned the towns of ordinary colonists and loyalists alike. Picture trying to sell someone on, "Join us, we're the good guys," while your ships are robbing their harbor at night. It was the worst possible advertisement for the young American nation. And here's the thing. The failed invasions weren't even the real reason Canada stayed British. The real reason was that Britain had just played a far smarter hand. Because the biggest prize in the north wasn't Nova Scotia, it was Quebec. And on paper, Quebec should have been the easiest place on earth to turn against the British crown.
Think about Quebec's position. It was the most populous colony in the north, tens of thousands of French Catholics. Britain had only ruled them for 16 years after conquering them from France. They were French, the British were English. They were Catholic, the British were Protestant. They had every reason in the world to resent London. And then, to top it off, when the American Revolution broke out, it was backed by France, Quebec's own mother country. By every logic, Quebec should have leapt at the chance to rebel. It didn't. Not even close.
Because in 1774, Britain made an almost unbelievably shrewd move, the Quebec Act. London legalized the French language, restored French civil law, and protected the Catholic faith. a faith that was at that very moment still banned back in Britain itself. The church could collect its tithes again. French landowners got a real stake in running things. All Britain asked for in return was loyalty. So while American colonists were marching in the streets, furious about taxes and no representation, French Canadians had just been handed a deal they actually liked. Try starting a revolution against that.
But there's a deeper reason Quebec didn't follow, and it's the most interesting part of the whole story. The American Revolution wasn't really just about taxes. It was a revolution of English Protestants, people who already had centuries of self-government baked into their culture, colonial assemblies that passed their own laws, the ideas of John Locke, the memory of England's own glorious revolution. That kind of political consciousness, the deep conviction that the governed should have a say, existed in the English colonies. In French Quebec, it mostly didn't yet. Back in France, the kings still sat at Versailles, the revolution hadn't happened, and democracy was something you debated in a Paris salon.
So here's the irony. Even if Britain had offered the 13 colonies the same sweet deal it gave Quebec, it probably wouldn't have worked. The Americans were just unusually, almost stubbornly political, ironically because of the very English traditions they'd inherited. Quebec, meanwhile, was content. They actually sent supplies to the British Army trapped in Boston. And when the Continental Congress sent Benjamin Franklin himself north to win them over, the Canadians said no. Why join a war with no guarantee of winning, against the same southern neighbors who'd burned their villages a few years before? By 1776, the North had made its choice. It would fight for the crown.
America didn't take the hint. It declared Canada fair game for annexation and circled back for a second try in a war that would end with that capital in flames. In June 1812, the United States declared war on Britain. The grievances were real. The British Navy was stopping American ships and forcing sailors into its own service, meddling in American trade and arming native nations on the frontier. But the Warhawks had another prize in mind, Canada, and they were certain it would be easy. Thomas Jefferson wrote that taking Canada would be little more than a matter of marching, a formality. They were already carving up the bear's hide before they'd caught it. Some wanted outright annexation, others wanted to trade it away for favors. The Canadians did not get the memo. The Americans managed to capture and burn York, today's Toronto, but that was about it. What followed was nearly 3 years of grinding, back and forth fighting along the Niagara, both sides trading the same scraps of border and slowly losing track of what they were even fighting for. Then came 1814. The British took most of Maine, and as direct payback for the burning of York, they marched on Washington and burned it. That's the scene we opened with. The White House, the Capitol, in flames.
But the Americans had their own wins. They held Baltimore, where the defense of a single fort inspired what became the national anthem, and they triumphed at New Orleans. Meanwhile, over in Europe, Napoleon was finally finished, and suddenly the war just went out of style. In 1815, both sides signed a peace, left the border exactly where it had been, and then each loudly announced that they had won. Which is the funny thing about the War of 1812. It's a war everyone thinks they won.
Americans remember bloodying the world's greatest navy at sea and treat the small matter of their capital burning down as a footnote. But for Canada, the War of 1812 became something bigger, their patriotic war. The story of a young David standing up to the American Goliath and saving the nation from being swallowed whole. In fact, in a 2012 poll, Canadians ranked their victory in the War of 1812 as the second most important thing for national unity. First place went to their healthcare system, which, given what they watch happen across the border, is fair enough. The British, for the record, barely remember the war happened at all.
But even 2 wars hadn't actually settled the question. What finally did was Canada deciding, once and for all, what it actually was. In 1823, the United States announced the Monroe Doctrine. America would stop meddling in Europe's colonies,
unless one of those colonies declared independence and the mother country struck back. That, they said, would be treated as an unfriendly act against the United States. It was clever on two levels at once. It told America's own war hawks to cool it on Canada, and at the same time, it quietly winked at Canadians. Go ahead and rebel. We've got you. The doctrine would shape American policy for the next half-century. And it worked on Canadian nerves. Through the mid-1800s, even Canadian conservatives flirted with American-style reform. In Quebec, of all places, the colony that had refused America twice, some English-speaking residents, nervous about growing French influence, actually pushed to join the United States. The pitch was practical. America offered markets, security, and the resources to finally settle Canada's empty West, just as the US was building its transcontinental railroad. Canada's own West was emptier than Siberia, with nearly everyone crammed along the southern border. Joining the giant next door started to sound reasonable.
But most of those movements didn't actually want to become American. They wanted to loosen London's grip, and were just borrowing America's ideas to do it. Because the United States was a brand with a dark side. For all its talk of freedom, there was the relentless expansionism, the militarism, and the slavery, which Canada had already abolished. French Canadians were firmly against joining. So Canadians ended up in a strange spot, more fed up with their southern neighbors than with Britain itself, but no longer quite able to think of themselves as British either, which left them with one question they could no longer dodge. Then who exactly are Canadians?
Two things finally pushed them to an answer. First, the Fenian raids. Irish Americans, blaming Britain for the famine that had devastated Ireland, launched cross-border attacks on Canada to pressure the empire. The US government didn't back them. President Grant even arrested their leaders, but it badly rattled Canadians. Then came the American Civil War. Britain had quietly backed the Confederacy, even letting agents use Canadian soil to stage raids on the northern states. That revived American calls to seize Canada outright. Suddenly, staying a scattered collection of colonies felt dangerous.
So, in the 1860s, the Canadian colonies did something genuinely difficult. Through conferences, debates, and actual elections, French and English, Catholic and Protestant, hammered out a deal to become a single country. In 1867, the British North America Act created the Dominion of Canada. They wanted one economy, a transcontinental railway of their own, and shared security. But underneath all of it was a simple motive: never to be swallowed by the United States. From a handful of scattered colonies, a country was born. Born in large part precisely so it would never have to become American.
From there, Canada drifted slowly but steadily toward full independence, and Britain, to its credit, didn't stand in the way. Over the decades, the British presence on the continent shrank until it was almost symbolic, the face of a distant monarch on a $20 bill. Canada had finally settled the question. Not a northern extension of the United States, not just a western outpost of Britain or France. Canada, its own thing, on purpose. And so we arrive right back where we started. Except everything has changed. Today, fewer than 1 in 10 Canadians wants to join the United States. And that same stretch of ground, where armies once marched to burn each other's capitals, it's now the longest undefended border on Earth. Thousands of miles of frontier that almost no one is watching. Two countries that kept choosing, sometimes at the point of a gun, to stay apart, and somehow ended up the best of friends. Because that's the thing about history. It's full of these moments where the whole map came within an inch of going a completely different way. If you want to see how close some of the others came, stick around. There are a lot more of them than you'd think.